Just talk about going to the land of the flower flag, and my countenance fills with happiness. Not without hard work were 1,000 pieces of gold dug up and gathered together. There were words of farewell to the parents, but the throat choked up first. There were many feelings, many tears flowing, face to face when parting with the wife. Waves big as mountains often astonished this traveler. With laws harsh as tigers, I had a taste of all the barbarities. Do not forget this day when you land ashore. Push yourself ahead, and do not be lazy or idle.
Xu, a Chinese immigrant who carved this poem into the wall at Angel Island, Ellis Island of the West, in the early 1900s. Closing the Golden Gate, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 violated the rights of Chinese immigrants for over half a century. In 1848, James Marshall discovered gold in California, and the world turns its eyes on America. Many Chinese men were poor in their homeland and thought they could make their fortunes in the new land. In the early days of the gold rush, Chinese immigration soared. The flow of Chinese to the New World continued, even after the initial golden opportunity faded. In the year 1880, there were around 100,000 Chinese in the U.S. Even without the easy fortune of gold, many Chinese opened laundry businesses or other businesses to sell goods, and the Chinese had a reputation as hard workers. The Chinese would do excellent work and for a fraction of the pay that a white citizen would demand. Many employers wanted to hire Chinese as cheap labor, and unlike white workers, the Chinese would not leave the job as soon as they had a few dollars, but they would stay and continue to work diligently and possibly get promoted. This made white laborers nervous, and they began to form anti-Chinese opinions. In actuality, the Chinese posed little to no threat at all. Around this time, Chinese Americans made up only 1/2000th of 1% of the U.S. population. The Chinese weren't stealing the jobs. The threat the white workers felt was coming from a wave of joblessness during the country's first economic recession. People became poor and unemployed, and they were looking for someone to blame. The first place their angry eyes turned to were the Chinese. The whites viewed the Chinese as an inferior race and thought they were taking jobs that belonged to white laborers. Employers began to shun Chinese workers, instead choosing to give the jobs to white workers, even though the Chinese had been suffering from the same recession, and many Chinese were poor and jobless. In 1870, California had passed the Cubic Air Law, which was aimed at lodging houses that crowded Chinese into small rooms. It stated that each adult had to have 500 cubic feet of clean air, or both tenants and landlords could be fined. They even created the Clean Air Board to ensure the law was obeyed. This was the first step towards more restricting and biased anti-Chinese laws that would limit and destroy the rights of Chinese immigrants. In 1873, California passed the Sidewalk Ordinance, which prevented people from using poles to carry goods on city sidewalks. The purpose of this was to discourage Chinese traders who carried their merchandise this way. That same year, California passed the Laundry Ordinance, which demanded fees from anyone who carried laundry when delivering it instead of using a wagon. This ordinance was aimed at Chinese laundry businesses, where the Chinese would often carry laundry door to door for their clients. Both the Sidewalk Ordinance and the Laundry Ordinance were bills of prevention, aimed at discouraging Chinese immigrants from owning a business. In 1878, the 15-passenger bill was brought before President Rutherford B. Hayes. It stated that one ship could only bring 15 Chinese immigrants at a time, but it was vetoed on March 1, 1879, as a violation of the Burlingame Treaty, passed in 1868 between the U.S. and China, allowing citizens of both countries to travel back and forth and stay as long as they wished. President Charles A. Arthur initially vetoed a bill that would ban Chinese labor, but they ignored their responsibility to fulfill the Burlingame Treaty and offer citizenship to Chinese immigrants. The year before the Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted, 40,000 Chinese entered the U.S., but the next year only 23 were allowed in. The Chinese Exclusion Act only banned laborers from entering the U.S., but merchants, students, teachers, and tourists were still allowed in. The Chinese Exclusion Act was an obvious violation of the Burlingame Treaty, but it was not repealed. In fact, after 10 years passed, it was renewed with the Geary Act. Not only did the Geary Act extend the exclusion of Chinese laborers for 10 more years, it removed even more of the rights of the Chinese.
The attitudes underlying the exclusion laws also restricted their kinds of opportunities, what kinds of work they could do, where they could live, their ability to have certain legal rights. It also meant that most of them were here without their families.
The Geary Act denied bail to Chinese in certain cases, and it gave Chinese 1 year to apply for a residence certificate. The Chinese Exclusion Act and the following Geary Act was the first time a single group of people were not allowed to immigrate to the U.S. But there was more to come. In 1893, the McCreary Act was passed, which amended the time period to apply for a residence certificate to 6 months, and redefined laborers to include merchants, laundry owners, miners, and fishermen. Also, the Scott Act was passed, which barred re-entry for Chinese who had left the U.S., even if they had been legal residents. Chinese Americans on a visit to the homeland were now stranded, and men planning on collecting their families were banned from leaving to get them and returning. Even long-time residents who chose to remain in the United States were required to carry certificates of eligibility to remain in the U.S. Without these certificates, they faced the risk of being deported. However, some Chinese looked to find ways around the stringent immigration laws, namely the creation of hundreds of paper sons and daughters. A family back in China could pay a fee to have a Chinese American list them as relatives, and when the Chinese family arrived on a ship to the U.S., they would be admitted as a family, but they were only family on paper, hence the name paper sons. However, this practice was difficult because of stringent interviewing that was meant to eliminate false family members from entering the country. Immigration officials would ask difficult questions about the family to the immigrant about to enter the U.S., and compare their answers to the answers of the Chinese American part of the family. If the answers varied enough, the new immigrant would be detained and likely deported back to China. The immigration officials had no guidelines on what questions to ask, and sometimes even the legitimate members of a family had varying answers, due to the fact that a Chinese American who had been residing in the U.S. for several years often remembered different things about their home village than a new immigrant who had just left home weeks before. For 61 years, the Chinese immigrants were denied of their basic rights, and the Chinese Exclusion Act was not repealed until 1943. Many Chinese maintained their false family histories all the way up to the repeal, and their last names were often false. Many Chinese Americans who were children of generations of illegal Chinese immigrants who had forged their history did not discover their true family history until years later. During the years of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the rights of the Chinese were consistently ignored by the government. The government felt it was their responsibility to do something drastic to combat the sudden wave of joblessness and a poor economy, and their solution was to listen to the anti-Chinese fearmongers in the West, and that became the birth of the first discriminatory immigration legislation aimed at one specific race. The denial of the rights of the Chinese was the first step down a risky path, and more discriminatory laws would follow against people of many races, but notably the internment camps for Japanese Americans during World War II and the Jim Crow laws discriminating against African Americans.
Well, it's foundational. It's the foundations of immigration restriction in terms of our rationales, and then also how we justify discriminating against certain groups, and then also in practice the institutions and the bureaucracies.
Racism, the belief that all members of each race possess characteristics or abilities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race or races. It causes people to forget the rights others have and to misuse their own.